Today I'm going to do a video over arrow length. Like most things in archery, there's no right or wrong answer. It's kind of personal preference, but things to take into account are what components are you going to use, your draw length, are you going to use these arrows for different broadheads and different bow setups. So things like that you want to take into consideration. For these arrows for right now, I'm going to just shoot the standard nocks, but when I hunt, I like to use lighted nocks. So I'm going to show you the difference between the standard nocks and the lighted nocks. So you can see the difference in the nocks there. There's about 1/4 of an inch difference just in the nock size. So that's something to take into consideration when you're building arrows. And then the biggest one is your insert. So I'm going to show you a couple different types of inserts and the ways that they're a little bit different. So this is the 4mm, just a half outsert. And then I also have the new components that come with these Easton Axis, which is probably what I'm going to use. So as you can see, this one's flush to the end of your arrow, so you can just cut your arrow and it's not really going to matter. On a component like the new ones, so you're going to want to slide that in, make sure it's all the way on. You can see it slides down and into the arrow. I'm going to make a mark here and then I'll measure it and tell you the difference. When I'm using an insert like this, I just like to slide it on, mark the back of it, and then I'll take it back off and measure that difference. So now when I'm cutting these arrows, it's about 5/16 of an inch. So I want to make sure that I add that onto wherever I want my arrow to end. Another option, just not going to use that, but just kind of to show you there, it slides onto the arrow. So if I was using this one, that's going to go on like a 1/2 inch. So just make sure that you pay attention to what components you're going to use. If you think that you're going to try a different component for a couple different arrows, make sure that you don't cut them all to the same length, because otherwise you might hit your rest here if you cut it too short. So I have my new arrow here. These are Easton Axis match grade 4mm long range. I'm going to be using a lighted nock on most of these because I will be using this for a hunting arrow. Unless if it is in a state that I can't use that, but then I'll just be 1/4 of an inch shorter if I use the standard nock with it. But for right now, I'm going to plan on using a lighted nock, so I'm going to cut it with that on. And then I'm going to plan on using the new Easton 55 grain outsert system. So I'm going to make sure where I want it to end, I'm going to add 1/4 of an inch to it. So I'm going to throw this arrow in the bow and show you, do a little close-up of how I like to cut them. I've got my bow drawn back. I put the lighted nock on to add in for that 1/4 of an inch difference. And so with that, if I put the stock nock back in, it's going to actually move the arrow back 1/4 of an inch. And I also have to make sure that I add about 1/4 of an inch for this Easton insert. So with the lighted nock on, that's probably how I'm mostly going to shoot it. So I got to make sure that I'm at least 1/2 of an inch, no matter what. So I'm going to go 3/4 just to make sure. This is the center. That's usually where I'd go, but since I'm trying to get the lightest arrow and the shortest arrow that I can, I'm just going to go 3/4 of an inch, and that should give me about 1/4 of an inch here. One thing to think about, if you do play with your draw length and you might be going a little bit longer, make sure you maybe go to that inch mark or maybe a little bit longer. For me, I've always been a 26-inch draw length. It hasn't really changed, so I like to make sure that I can get pretty good speeds out of a setup. So by cutting this arrow a little bit shorter, that is what works best for me. So now I've got my 3/4 mark on here. Like I said, when I cut this, that 1/4 of an inch, so my insert's going to end up being right there. And that'll leave me about 1/2 of an inch to the arrow rest itself. And if I switch out the nocks, it's going to be really close. I'm going to go ahead and switch out the nock just to show you where that's going to end up at. Okay, so I've got that switched out. I have it switched out now, and now you can see I'm right in line with the riser there. And when that insert comes in, it's going to put me right here. So I'm only going to be about 1/4 of an inch away from that. That is the absolute shortest I would cut this arrow. So when you're cutting arrows, one thing to think about is if you're going to add a lot of point weight to the front of your arrow, you're going to want to cut your arrows as close to the rest as you possibly can. What this is going to do is it's going to stiffen up your arrow. If you leave the arrow longer, you're putting that point weight out even farther, and you're going to need to shoot a stiffer spined arrow to control that. For me, I like to have most of my weight on the front of the arrow and not on the back of the arrow. So for me, I'm trying to push the highest spine I can because I really like to shoot a lighter arrow, and that allows me to put more of the weight up front on that arrow. So if I cut it as close as I can to that rest, it's going to stiffen up the arrow and then allow me to add that point weight and still maybe be able to shoot a little bit of a higher spined arrow. Whereas if I'm going to be longer, I'm going to add more point weight, I'm going to need to shoot a lower spined arrow. So for me, I'm right in between like a 350 to 300 spine arrow. And by cutting it a little bit shorter, what this allows me to do is get away with a 350 spine arrow. For everybody, their setup's going to be a little bit different. One thing you need to think about too is if you're trying to shoot a really, really heavy arrow, the shorter you cut that arrow, the less that arrow is going to weigh. But by cutting it shorter, you're going to have a lot less wobble, and then you're going to get more FOC by cutting it shorter. So for most people, I think you're going to be on board with cutting the arrow shorter, getting a little bit higher FOC, and then also you can be maybe just right on the line of a little bit of a higher spine arrow. I hope this video helped you on kind of choosing and determining what length to cut your arrows at. Like I said, there's no set in stone answer for this. If you're going to shoot, let's say like a turkey broadhead that's really big, do not cut it to where you're going to be into your riser, or that broadhead will hit your bow and you will never get that arrow to work. So if that's something you're thinking about, make sure you cut your arrow long. Like I said, the biggest things to think about are what components are you going to use with your arrow, and are you trying to go with the highest spine as possible, or are you just trying to go with a pretty stiff spine so you can get a little bit more weight. And if you're a growing archer, make sure that you leave yourself some room, because if you're going to want to use those arrows for years to come, you're probably going to be adding inches onto your draw length, and you're going to need to make sure that it is long enough to be able to grow into. But you can be too long. These are just some tips that I use when cutting arrows. There's no right answer, and if you're like me, tinker around with it, see what works for you and what you like the best. Hope this helped. If it did help you, please subscribe to my channel. I'm always doing different videos on tinkering with things, new gear, or just any kind of new products that come up that interest me. Thanks for watching, and stay hidden. Disclaimer, do not step in front of your bow if you have it in a draw board or something like that, because you never know what could happen, so make sure you're safe with it. Thanks for watching.